by our good friend and third Mike, Ryan Christian, the last American vagabond, here in a bit. And right out of the gate, and I love these conversations. We're very fortunate to have them. We are joined by the eminent scholar and academic and from wow, gosh, all kinds of black. Should I announce Pandata first? Because then there's Organization of Propaganda Studies and the 9/11 Syria. You do a lot, sir. You do a lot, Piers. It's good to have you back. Good to see you.
It's good to be with you. I mean, I'm Organization for Propaganda Studies. I also do some work with Panda, editor of Propaganda in Focus, of course. I'm always nudged by my co-editors to remind everybody. So, yeah, and carrying on, researching, writing, doing all those kind of things. So busy, too busy.
So there was a point about last year, a little bit before last year, when you were in Berlin and Germany was absolutely COVID crazy, and there was a ton of restrictions going on. And I don't know if we had a follow-up question about what it was like there right now in the interim times that you've been on. But what is kind of the overall atmosphere in Germany at the moment, especially considering, or at least we're seeing videos of NATO protests. There's been significant damage done to the country, in no small part by U.S. foreign policy aims.
Yeah, I mean, it was a nightmare in Germany for a while with the COVID response. They were, of course, threatening to mandate injections on the entire population. Lauterbach was promoting that. So there was a period in 2021 where there was a real fear that that was going to be imposed. Austria tried it, and of course it came off the rails, but they never got that through. And since then, as has been the case in I think the US and in Britain, there's been a pretty significant, not all the way, but a pretty significant unraveling on the COVID narrative. Awareness of the problems of injections, for example, criticism of the lockdown, etc. And I wouldn't say that there is a political consensus recognizing that the response was clearly wrong. But there's certainly a lot of question marks and so on. And broadly speaking, I mean, they lifted masking, for example, on public transport about 2-3 weeks ago, and they've just lifted it for the hospitals as well. So, that one seems to be sort of unraveling in a pretty big way. But as you were hinting, COVID-19 has segued into the war propaganda phase, and Ukraine. Well, it's dominated political debate, but it's not dominating the street, in my experience. I didn't think, even from the beginning, even though they were putting Ukrainian flags up on government buildings, and they renamed the Russian Museum just down the road from me, where they signed the surrender at the end of the Second World War, and they renamed that to get Russia out of the title. There has never, in my experience, been a big grassroots support for NATO's policy in the Ukraine. And as you rightly pointed out just a couple of weeks ago, led by Zara Wagenknecht, the Linke politician, there was a very impressive, pretty much organized at the last minute, anti-war protest at the Brandenburg Gate. And it pulled, I mean, some people were estimating up to 50,000 people. And I think that shows, a pretty good sign of the level of questioning that there is, certainly in regard to NATO policy in the Ukraine. To sum all of that up, I mean, yes, the COVID narrative is starting to get into trouble here in the way that it has, I think, in other countries in the West, although we've got a long way to go on that. But obviously, the war and Ukraine and so on is seizing the minds of the politicians, and we'll see where all of that goes from here. So I think overall, it has been a tense time for several years now, and not going away with the situation in Ukraine. So I think that's kind of like my reading of what's happening at the surface level at the moment.
You're muted, Pasta, if you're trying to jump in.
Dr. Robinson, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine.
Check your microphone settings, because if
I
Piers,
did. It was in the audio. It should be
no,
fine.
I had you muted, and I heard Dr. Robinson when he was moving his hands around. It could have been that, or just the microphone being very sensitive. Either way, not important. We can work through it. I just want to know that, yeah, you said on the surface, but what is it going to take for it to crack within our Congress, within our parliament? Because no matter what, these guys, just the other day, Biden and Olaf got in a room, they locked themselves in for an hour, they come out, who knows what the hell they're talking about, and they come out, and guess what? More money and weapons are going, and this gravy train hasn't stopped. And, you know, we obviously see what's going on in Syria right now. It's just disgusting. Israel bombed Syria's airport yesterday, and that's their lifeline, while the United States is strangling them off. When are we going to stop funding these escapades, especially when it comes to Ukraine and Syria?
Well, for sure, the machine is not stopping. I mean, as I'm sure both of you are aware, and I think I've heard both of you speak about this and speak with others from the resistance, if you want to call it that. You know, there are question marks over COVID-19 and the entities pushing that agenda, and the overlap with the geopolitical situation we're seeing in the Ukraine, and perhaps we can come to that later. But it's certainly very clear, okay, separating away from COVID and the technocratic globalist kind of agenda that we saw with that. Certainly what we're seeing in Syria, Ukraine, etc., the escalation with Russia. I mean, this is, I always, let's keep it simple. This is the military industrial complex, which has been there for a long time. And Eisenhower warned us about this. And so on, as he is stepping down as US president. You know, this is the military industrial complex, the war machine, the permanent war machine, which has become integrated into Western democracies in a very profound way. And I think it has been in a big way responsible for stealing our democracies from us. And that war machine is absolutely still going, as you suggest, and there's no sign of it stopping. However, I mean, you said, when is this going to crack? You know, if we read the overall geopolitical situation, I mean, my assessment is that the Western hegemony is in significant trouble at this point in time for a whole variety of reasons. But you know, there's clearly a shift in what one would historically describe as, you know, the key indicators of the balance of power, military, economic, etc. That is transforming at this point in time. And I think that the war machine is almost that they've rolled the dice again after all the wars which have been initiated, exacerbated, etc., since 9/11, and they've got to the logical endpoint of this, of confronting Russia and then possibly taking on China. And I think that the elite bloc which is driving this are looking, at least to me, to be that they will become increasingly isolated. I'm not convinced that NATO's claims and Biden's claims about what they can achieve in the Ukraine is actually realistic. I'm not a military analyst, but ultimately what they're talking about is an area of land essentially sort of on the Russian border, or now part of Russia, and retaking that militarily is something which I can't quite see how NATO could ever expect to achieve that. So, you know, I wonder, and again, just as trying to answer your question, is it going to crack? You know, the war machine's still driving on. This is the military-industrial complex we're all familiar with. But I'm wondering if we're reaching a point where it can't go any further. And if you have a strategic failure, for example, in the Ukraine, which seems very, very likely, that could send the kind of shockwaves through the elite establishment, which might start to cause some rethinking, at least about Western belligerence in the international system. It's war making in Syria, as you point out. All of the countries that we've seen over the period since 9/11, but also prior to that, obviously, you know, Vietnam, etc., Central America, South America, all of those interventions we've seen throughout the 20th century. And, you know, there's a good historical comparison, although you have to be cautious about these. But if you look at the British and the Suez crisis, and you know the British, you know, conspired with Israel and with France, and in order to retake the Suez Canal, so that they got Israel to attack Egypt, etc. And that was the wheels came off that in spectacular fashion. No one in the world believed Britain's claim to be acting sort of as a peacekeeper. Everyone realized it was a blatant attempt to retake the Suez Canal, which was essential to the British Empire. And it completely came off the rails. And it was, in a sense, a major strategic failure for Britain and the British Empire. And at that point, that was when the awareness started to really take hold across the British foreign policy establishment that the empire had to go. Britain did not have the economic, military, political clout, etc., to maintain its empire. And you saw the process towards decolonization accelerating at that point. So, it could be that with this, if Ukraine does not go the way that NATO and Biden want it to, this could ultimately be seen as a strategic failure, which does create those ripples through the elite and sort of create the opportunity, or you have breaks in the opportunity structure for other elites to try and change course. Of course, maybe as you're about to say, or they could just go for an escalation.
Well,
drag in China.
So yeah, that's what I think they're pivoting towards China. They're obviously they're beefing up defense within the budget. They just sent them $69 million worth of, I believe they're like Patriot style missiles for defense, and yet the United States and Taiwan seem to be saying to China, "You ready to go? Let's go." But what I was asking was do you think that, because you mentioned in the beginning that there are people, the street sense of sorts, I think you kind of framed it, or the sense out and about is a little bit different than what we're seeing on the TV and Parliament and stuff. Do you think that Ukraine's going to be a situation, and I know you're just taking a shot at it, but where you're at, because in Europe, you guys are giving us some hope the way you guys are getting in the streets. We're not getting in the streets the way we need to over here. I guess because it's not affecting us as much with the energy situation. But do you think there can be a combination of the two, old school way where we get enough butts and bodies in the streets, plus they start failing in Ukraine? Because I don't know if there's such thing as a failure. They wanted a proxy war against Russia. What they wanted to weaken Russia. They got what they wanted. I think they got it for a year, so it's bonus time. But do you think that from what you're seeing maybe in the streets there, that we can see a combination of the two? They start to realize that they're not getting what they want territorial wise, and they're losing. They might lose Ukraine altogether at the end of this. I'm thinking after they completely surround Bakhmut, they bring in the 250,000 reservists. They just march to Kiev and say, we're not going to have this type of government anymore. But could it be maybe this thing, Piers, where Congress and they realize the elites, they're failing, but bodies and minds are in the street because they're conscious of what's going on? And we end maybe Syria and we end maybe Ukraine?
Well, sure is a pretty optimistic picture that one can paint there. But I think you're right. I mean, look, if you look at major instances of major social change in history, and I'm trying to claw back from my memory when I used to teach new social movements, whether it's the suffragettes, gay rights, etc., any of these movements, there's always this combination of grassroots pressure and then elites starting to conjoin with those grassroots movements. And that always seems to be important. I mean, movements are rarely purely grassroots, and they are never purely elite sort of driven, as it were. There's a combination of the two. And for sure, I think on the Ukraine, a combination of, if NATO doesn't get its way and is just unable to get its way, combined with a lot of very alarmed and understandably alarmed Germans and European citizens fearful of a war which escalates in the heart of Europe. And of course, Europeans, Europe is familiar with major wars being fought on its territory. That could create the kind of pressure that's needed to push through and help change course. I mean, you're right. I mean, we're not there yet. But I think, if you look at the resistance to the COVID strategy, or to the whole COVID, whatever you want to call it, COVID events, PSYOP, all of that. I mean, there was, that was a powerful propaganda campaign behind that. but reasonably quickly. I mean, people were out on the streets and protesting in Berlin, here in Germany. Within months, within weeks, people were protesting in the Rosa Luxemburg Square. And then, of course, Kennedy came and spoke in August, I think it was, in Berlin, saying we're going into a global totalitarian system with the response to COVID-19. So there was a lot of pushback to that, and of course with COVID, a lot of people, in my experience, have woken up to problems of concentration of power, the realities that the mainstream media doesn't really tell you a very accurate picture of what's going on. That governments do not necessarily have the best interests of their populations at heart. The number of people who come to realize that through COVID, I think, is significant, and that's potentially can carry through to Ukraine and carry through to whatever other kind of event they might try to exploit in order to push through restructuring the society and so on. So we've got to. Would it be fair to say, in a way, you have kind of like a battle-hardened population after COVID, and people waking up to a lot of things, and that creates, I think, capacity for what you described, the potential for enough grassroots movements, pressure, combining with some people in the elite, hopefully realizing that we need to change course, or maybe this isn't such a good idea after all, and so on. I mean, I heard Kennedy's going to run for president. Is that right?
He's considering.
How's my audio, real quick, because I can pop out.
It's good.
No, you're good. You're good.
Okay. I heard considering. I didn't hear filed. What about you, Pasta?
Considering. He told the crowd he was considering.
So, in a way, this is, and I don't know, I'm not necessarily endorsing. I would not want to interfere in the American political system in any shape or form. It's good if you've got sort of credible, significant people from the elite establishment, and he is, although marginalized. That's an important thing to see, and should, in some ways, give us a bit of optimism about being able to push back against. I know I sound like a broken record. I've said this 100 times in interviews. We have pretty broken political structures in Western liberal democracies. We don't have democracy anymore.
Let me ask you a question.
We need to fix it.
In regards to that, Piers, because we all know that there's no way there's not nary a snowball's chance that Robert Kennedy gets a nomination running in either of the major political parties. We have historically seen what happens to third-party candidates, not least of all Jill Stein being handcuffed to a chair to prevent her from being able to debate. Do you think, and then we'll bring in Ryan too, do you think that Robert Kennedy, should he decide to throw his hat into the ring, does it under some nebulous third-party organization, a medical freedom party? Like where would you let's say for a moment that you do want to interfere in American political affairs. Let's give you the let's interfere with American political affairs hat and just let you run wild. What would you advise Robert Kennedy Jr.?
I mean, I'm not a political strategist, so this would be just my guesswork. Right. I can analyze and research and try to explain various things and so on, but advising on the best political strategy. I mean, I think that the problems. Okay, here would be me here is me taking a shot at it. I think the problems are so significant with our existing major political parties. And we have such a deeply corrupted political system across Western democracies. And when I say political system, I also mean our society. So mainstream media, academia, and the non-governmental organization complex, civil society, the kind of corruption by money, etc. These things are so deep-rooted, and they're so deep-rooted in the political parties that one's inclined to think that at this point the only way that we're really going to have a proper pushback against all of this is for credible people to lead significant grassroots movements and carve out a very new path, not just join an existing political structure. I mean, here in Germany, I mean, Sarah Wagenknecht has had a hell of a time with Die Linke and battling within that party. And I think a lot of people in Germany would like her to set up a new party. I don't quote me on this. Maybe I shouldn't say it on air, but somebody said to me that sort of if she ran, she'd get 20% straight away of the German population. There's a lot of people behind her. So I think the situation's so bad. We're in such a mess, and kind of like COVID demonstrates that for anyone who had any lingering doubts. Whitney Webb's latest book on Epstein, which some friends have been sort of informing me about, show how corrupt our system has become. For those who hadn't realized that, but I think there are good rational grounds to say no. We need to start afresh. We do need members of the elite to help, and perhaps lead. Maybe lead is the wrong word, but we need people within the elite to have the courage to stand up and realize that we need to change course, and then people need to get active and get behind that. But I'm thinking we need something fresh and new. I mean, do either of you think that Kennedy would be well placed to go into the Democrat Party and that he could succeed through that mechanism? Or
I mean,
Medical Freedom Party with Judge Napolitano is what I heard the rumor to be.
That's it. We're gonna go ahead and bring Ryan in. It is Tuesday. It is T-Lab Tuesday. Ryan Christian, the host of Last American Vagabond, is our third mic on this auspicious day of the week. Ryan, good to see you, my friend.
Good morning, guys. Piers, how are you, brother?
I'm okay. How are you?
Good.
There's a very nicely shaved head, my friend.
As always. It's an interesting conversation, though. It's my personal take, since that's what you're talking about. I don't see personally. I think it's a bad choice if you're anybody who wants to do something different and actually change something to go through the system as it is. Personally, I think even that includes a third party. That's just my opinion on how problematic we really are right now. But just for sake of conversation, I mean, I wonder why Trump didn't do that last time or even this time. Like that, in my opinion, you would do what he did last time, even bigger this time. You would awaken even more of that grouping that doesn't really even engage. And I think that's how that happened the first time, is a lot of those people that had never been involved before suddenly got motivated. This guy thinks what we do. And, the man of the people, kind of an illusion, in my opinion. But yeah, I think that if RFK decides to try to do this through one of those parties, it'll either be manipulated like we've seen in the past or just not allowed to happen. I mean, I'm jaded, but I think a third party would be interesting to see if he went that route.
Yeah. So we kind of agree that we need, and I mean, there are signs of this, right? I mean, there are various movements, groups which are trying to think along political lines now. I mean, there's Not Our Future in the UK was set up about 4 or 5 months back on a broad kind of challenging the technocratic agenda, and so on. So I think sort of there are signs of this happening, but yeah, we'll see how it develops. But yeah, I agree. I think we need a developing grassroots movement coalescing around a number of credible, courageous people who are willing to, if not set up a party. I mean, what's the other option you're suggesting? That there's, I mean, we can think more creatively about how to challenge the power structure.
We can go town to town teaching people how to debank. We can go town to town teaching people how to grow food where they're at. I mean, I really and truly believe that unless we break the grasp that central banks have on nation states in general and the conglomerates that really make the decisions for nation states, then we don't get to do any of the things that we want to do. So I truly believe that teaching people about the counter economy and about parallel structures are going to be vital to this. Whatever grassroots movements arise from there Awesome. But as long as we all agree that we've got to decouple from central banking, and that is one of the, if not the primary entity responsible for the way that the predator class moves and operates, then I don't think we get to go very far. And unfortunately, most of the left movements and a significant number of the ones on the right haven't made this connection yet.
This is why I've often argued more so lately today that look, anybody out there who's politically motivated, I'm never trying to tell you not to do that. I mean, action's good, in my opinion, with good intentions anywhere, right? But my personal opinion is that we've been driven into a position where it no longer has any effect ultimately. So I've argued more so today that the message part of what we're doing is more important than anything. Like, so if RFK gets this movement going and gets enough attention on what they're saying on that stage, I find that to be far more powerful and important than whether or not he gets elected in some broken system. You know, I mean, call me jaded, I am, but I think that, I mean, think about what the people he could reach with the basic information that we all seem to think is obviously, it's just on the table, right on the surface today. There's a lot of people that don't even know that's there, that have been conditioned to dismiss it. If he's on some, I mean, let's just picture him. I don't think that's going to happen, but on some kind of a stage where the world's paying attention in a massive US election, that could change everything, truly, if we have enough momentum, you know?
Well, if he goes and runs as a Democrat, which is also another rumor too as well, can they deny him the stage? How long can they deny him the stage for? I think they'll have to give him a couple cracks in the beginning when they have a loaded stage. He can't talk too much. But I do think that's the route to go, is either if you go in one party, let them throw you out and immediately go to the third party that's offering you that ticket. Like,
why wouldn't you start though with the third party? In that, if you know that's what's going to happen.
Because I think what's more important is what you just said. The fact that he gets in there with those people, and you know what I'm saying? I think it's more important, the debate stage. I know debates are bullshit, they're a bunch of crap anyways, but they're so effective and they mean so much to the public, they pay so much attention to them, that if he were to get on stage and start, you know, jousting back and forth with a Kamala Harris or a Pete Buttigieg or someone else, and then came back and was able to lay them down, you know what I'm saying? Like Bernie in 2016, when he eventually lost the Democratic nomination, Jill Stein was there, was like, take this, I'll be your vice president. And they had a lot of ballot access at that time, and they would have probably been able to work to get more. So that would have been the perfect pivot. That's what Dr. Cornel West, that's what Chris Hedges, that's what they were pushing Bernie to do. Like, you can just go right here to the Green Party. It's kind of like a vacant party. It doesn't have a real leader. You know, it had people like Jill Stein and the Jamu Baraka who were good, but he should have took that mantle and gone right with it. Or if it happens for Kennedy and the Libertarian parties there for him waiting, you know what I'm saying? Who knows? I think that would be the route, but I do believe what you said, Ryan, is the most important thing. You're not running to win. You're running to get exposure, to create a movement, because we know the system's rigged anyways. And even as an election integrity activist, I can tell you there's no shot for anybody to come up and try to actually win the presidency. So
it's an interesting topic, though, isn't it? Right? Like, people will hear even that and be like, conspiracy theory, right? But is it that far? Is it really that far outside the realm of possibility that, like, look, we know this stuff's controlled. They even admit that. They just argue it's controlled for certain reasons. But I mean, I'll state right now, I'll be wildly shocked if he even gets any real attention on the main stages of any corporate media at all. He's going to be, this is my opinion, relegated to conspiracy theory, anti-vaxxer, the same dumb stuff they say today. And they'll just do what they did with other candidates we've already seen who had, I mean, anyone has a right to be on that stage. But the way they see it, there are people that were in even the level you would argue had the right on the stage in previous elections, and they still boxed him out. You know, someone like a Ron Paul, for example. It's so clear how you can see how this can happen. So I just don't see how that's even. I think if I were in his position, I would immediately try to run third party. If assuming you think you can do something in this election, and try to work your way through those avenues, there is a huge sleeping giant of people out there that are willing to step up and support somebody who they believe actually cares about what they care about, and not just the wedge issues, but, you know, medical freedom stuff, these core values today, you know?
I think in some ways we're at a point in time for Western democracies where, you know, the lies are becoming so obvious, which have been pushed for a long time, and the kind of strength of the argument that we need to change is so powerful that I think you're right. You know, it doesn't matter where, you know, if he goes into a mainstream party or not. It's just the fact that he's saying these things, because, you know, the stuff which happened over the Tucker Carlson and the Kennedy files before Christmas, where they had supposedly some person who had seen the files and said, well, the CIA were responsible for killing Kennedy, and Kennedy came out and backed that up with a tweet and said, yes, my uncle was killed by the CIA. Those simple, powerful facts, being communicated to enough of the American public, is a real wake-up call and can have a huge effect in exactly the way you described. So I kind of agree. It doesn't matter where, sort of, what platform you go into. It's probably worth getting into the Democrat Party, causing some chaos, getting kicked out, and then setting up another party, and so on. But the other point, sort of going back a few steps, is that what people can do. I like this idea that was suggested of the parallel society. We all forget about setting up a political party and so on. But think about creation of parallel societies, getting out of the central bank digital currency issue area. People as you do with independent media. Okay, you're sure Kennedy won't get onto the mainstream media, although they will feel the pressure. But look at how many people now pay attention to the independent, non-legacy, non-mainstream media. Is huge. And so on. So sort of doing what, for example, you're doing in relation to journalism, doing what others, such as myself, are doing in relation to academia, building parallel structures, etc. And then that just draws people. I think that's a powerful way of affecting change. It's not organized in the sense of creating a political party or a movement, but it's saying that these things are broken, let's replace them. And I know I've got to be careful about who I quote and who I mention, but there are the Joe Rogans and the Russell Brands out there and so on. But they're outgunning CNN as far as I can see a lot of the time. And I know that there are issues and problems, and we can have that debate another time. But they're sort of outside of the mainstream, the MSNBC, etc., the BBC. And I mean, look, they are struggling. I mean, the BBC just did one of their, I think.
We lose him. You still there, Piers?
Can you hear me?
There you are. There you are. You paused there for a moment. We were just about to kick We were just about to kick around the BBC. It was fantastic.
Cool.
I'm all for it.
Oh, he's freezing up again. I was just looking at his tweet this morning. Actually, you back? Wait, until he comes back, he was just sharing something about. Unless you want to talk about it, Steve, the BBC tweet that he put out. You back there, Piers? Can you hear us?
Yeah, we could pull that up real quick.
Yeah, I'm back.
Oh, there he is. He's back.
No, okay. I'll just finish up my point really quickly. So the BBC, and I think in tandem with the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who have been kicking a few dissidents for a few years, just had this big attack on Twitter and Elon Musk, etc. And the few tweets that I saw were being put out by the BBC and their disinformation experts were getting ratioed, absolutely hammered. And you're seeing this time and time again. Ursula von der Leyen, the EU commissioner, she'll throw out a tweet and she'll get ratioed pretty quickly on issues. So, there is a lot of understanding and awareness there. And, the mainstream media, I think, in looking at their trust ratings, they seem to be sunk a hole below the waterline, to be quite honest. So, if we see as we go into the future, the independent media guys such as yourselves, other people in the independent realm, those who are perhaps closer to the mainstream, but still, saying some useful things, etc. That can change the game entirely, I think. So
we were just talking
parallel structures.
Yeah, we were just talking about this actually. Like, in my opinion, this seems right now, at least perception wise, that we are setting the narrative. Like, for historically, it's if the corporate media engages in some independent media, it's about exposing how ridiculous it is and why it's so unimportant, which clearly suggests it's somewhat important that they're looking at it. But today, whether it's Ukraine, COVID, Ohio, they're immediately stepping in to go, here's what they're saying and here's why it's not true. So it's interesting. That's an important shift to notice. Like, so now they have to engage with us. So that's a win right there. No matter how you spin it.
Absolutely. In a sense, they're on the defensive.
Exactly.
Now, but they're having to engage, and they're having to engage in a battle which they just can't win. I mean, and this is my sort of academic background looking at political communication, you know, we've known for decades that the mainstream media has been co-opted by political and economic power, and you know, book after book has been written on it, study after study, etc. You know, and now the writing is on the wall. So you know, they're having to engage, and I don't think they can win. Which of course is why I suspect they've escalated the censorship, in the sense that you're seeing the online harm legislation concept of disinformation, counter disinformation industry, integrating this vast array of fact-checking entities, deciding what is true and what is not true, into legislation on social media, etc. And of course, the really heavy-handed, very blunt censorship we saw during COVID, with people just being deplatformed, etc. That they've been forced into that corner of having to do that. And of course, Julian Assange is a kind of a symbolic, I think, entity for them, for the establishment, saying this is what happens to you if you, piss us off too much with information and leaks, etc. But this is always, as you kind of said, they're on the defensive. This is a sign of weakness. They're having to go to this point where they're having to engage in totally irrational censorship of information which they define as disinformation, against all principles of open debate, rational debate, scientific debate, whatever you want to call it, and so on. The fact that they're pushed to do that, they're destroying their credibility in the eyes of more and more people. And again, this is a new battle with the counter disinformation industry and the online harms legislation. But as with, for example, the World Health Organization pandemic preparedness agenda, awareness of these things is much higher than it was even just a year ago. People, a lot more people have woken up to how problematic these things are. So yeah, it's too much to say they're on the run, isn't it? Because they're not. They hold too powerful a position, but they're certainly having to respond now, and so we just keep on doing what we're doing in our own particular ways. And
you're here, exactly. The online harms legislation, that's an interesting step into where, I mean, this is what we were all talking about a long time ago, right? That this is where it was going. It's sort of like they're coming for your guns conversation. It's like fake, fake, fake. And then as they're taking it, it's like this, we keep watching how that happens. And so this is now the living embodiment of what they were saying was fake a moment ago. And now they're literally coming to a point to where they're like, we're deciding what you can and can't talk about, who you can engage with. I mean, it's just like such a quick, rapid jump. I don't know if you guys saw, what's her name? Nina Jankowicz, or is that her name? Yeah. She's now actually like out there with her hands out trying to get donations because she claims that she was the victim of a concerted disinformation attack, when the reality is it's just the inverse of the reality, but she's getting donations from people. They just want to engage with that reality because that's what they like to hear. I keep going back to the Bilderberg note, the point of post-truth world, where they discussed this. It was one of their talking points years ago. And I just can't stop thinking about how it's, obviously we talked about it then. That's where we've gotten to where people in any conversation are just choosing what they want. I was actually just engaging with people about the Ioannidis peer-reviewed study on Science Direct about the infection fatality rate pre-vaccination. And it's like I'm trying to inform people and trying to be calm, and people just don't want to hear it. They don't want to see, these are the trust the science crowd. And now they're not even engaging with the new body of science. They're going back to say, oh, well, now we dispute who's peer reviewing it. It's like, my God, it's like, it's just, we're at a point now where, like, I guess my point is, we can discuss it, is how do we get past that? Like, how do we engage with people at a point where they don't even want to see information? They just want a narrative battle, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, this is something which has been brewing, hasn't it, since the Trump election in 2016? The fake news, and you could see the counter disinformation industry, these concepts of disinformation, malinformation, etc., starting to take hold and penetrate the minds of formerly sensible academics, for example. And that has created, yes, this kind of rather absurd kind of environment where people don't seem to engage rationally. So you just can't debate with them, as you say. I mean, I do think that's an element of what we're seeing. But what we're also seeing, I think, is that, look, that there is a liberal is the wrong way of describing it, but there is an extreme center. I think some people use this phrase, don't they? It's not a left-right issue. We're talking about an extreme center, which kind of sees itself as liberal, of course. And this is a tie back to the military-industrial complex. The liberals seeing themselves were a benign force in the international system, bringing democracy, etc. And this is a core worldview for this block in society, this kind of extreme center liberal core. And the problem is their world is falling apart around them. You know, the deceptions which have underpinned, go back to JFK assassination, for example, you know, these things are fundamental to their worldview. And you know, it's so close to crumbling entirely. But I imagine they're in some of these people are in a state of panic. You know, there's cognitive dissonance and so on. But there is an absolute refusal just to acknowledge. And so this is a battle for them. And I know, I mean, I've given this example before, but, you know, getting people to understand concepts such as state crimes against democracy and the idea that your government might do bad things to you, not just to other people. In other countries, you know, this is the same kind of problem you have with people when you have child abuse within a family, and the siblings and the mother, for example, simply don't want to recognize that say, for example, the father is carrying out abuse, and so they block it off entirely. And it's a similar relationship between people and their governments, and I think people have a great difficulty getting over this hurdle that actually your government and these elites, etc., might do very, very nefarious things to you. You know, you can accept that, yet they start wars and kill people over there, etc. But this is the kind of hurdle which, and we're talking about the blue ticks here, aren't we? We're talking about the military-industrial complex, the gaggle of journalists around that, all the people who are pushing the COVID narrative, all of these people, you know, supporting Fauci, etc. We know we will come across these people in our daily lives, but they're so wedded to this worldview that it's going to be very difficult for them, I think, ever to come to terms with the fact that they have been living a lie, or they're sort of, you know, what they thought that they were. They are not actually. You know, we're not liberal and we're not nice, and we've been doing very bad things around the world. I think that bubble just gets smaller and smaller, and I'm not sure these people can ever be persuaded. I think we should be more concerned about the wider audience out there. I do have a faith in, you know, most people are smart enough to understand most of the issues that we talk about. They need to get good information, be allowed to debate, etc. And these are the people that we wake up and so on. But this bunch of people, I mean, you know, people in the Atlantic Council and Anne Applebaum and all of those characters pushing on the Ukraine. I mean, you know, I could make some very inappropriate historical comparisons, so I won't. You know, these people are so stuck in that mindset. I'm not sure they'll ever come out of it. I mean, Tony Blair hasn't come out and said that, you know, he lied over weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He still has some kind of rationalization for it. He could just be lying, or he could just completely internalize and be unable to change his opinion. So, you know, these people are stuck, but there's more. Ultimately, there'll be more of us than there are of them, and they'll end up on, it's a well-worn phrase, isn't it, but on the wrong side of history.
Tony Blair. I'm just
saying, maybe we should be sympathetic towards them because their world is crumbling.
Tony Blair's running around pushing digital ID through his Skeletor-like face. And I'm not entirely sure. I mean, he's in support of every current war. He's in support. That's what he does. He's part of a couple of
that's what he does.
He's part of a couple of think tanks that you know, promote it and all that kind of stuff. It's just, that's his job. He's an emaciated halfway through that last scene in Indiana Jones where he grabs the wrong cup transition of, you know, before he finally like just sort of sheds the skin entirely and slithers away like the Queen did. It's not. I mean,
he'd be terribly.
I'm not
upset.
a fan.
He's a very vain man. I think he would be very upset. He probably has some kind of self-image, which is some dashing, handsome ex-prime minister. Well, yeah, right. But he's one of the he's one of the key members of the extreme centre, and this, you know, became obvious with Iraq and whole global war on terror and all of the issues surrounding that. You know, he was plotting wars in the weeks after 9/11 with George Bush, as was confirmed by the Chilcot report documents which came out, and so on. So he's well on board with that kind of that globalist technocratic elite group, which I think has its roots in the West, but the tentacles reach out to other power centers in the world. But he's clearly a part of that, and yeah, it's become blatantly obvious with COVID. He's pushing injections, he's pushing digital ID. But again, you know, a lot of people, you know, he had a tough time because when he came out and spoke during COVID, people will be piling in on him over Iraq. It would be, don't listen to Tony Blair. So, you know, people have not forgotten entirely that phase from his history. But yeah, he's a good example, and it's the same network. It's, if you think of power networks and elite groups, he is one of the key players in these networks. As is, I mean, who else is? I mean, the list is so long, isn't it? But you know, Bill Gates. Etc. All of these people who clearly, you know, represent our key players in an elite, a combination of blocks. I mean, Kees van der Paal's book States of Emergency is good in this. He talks about the emergence of this new class block, and you got sort of big pharma, big tech, and you got the military-industrial complex, etc. But yeah, he's for sure part of that, and that's blatantly obvious now.
Remember when the term big pharma was a conspiracy theory? You know, like these things like, oh, that's ridiculous, you know. But you point out something interesting about Blair is, you know, the same kind of overlap is that, well, we all know, I mean, arguably most people know the reality around the lies from Iraq. I mean, this is just a no-brainer at this point. You can look it up on Wikipedia for crying out loud. Not that that means that it's true, but just it's mass adoption. But yet Blair will say, but here's my rationale. Regardless of how completely disconnected it is from the truth, there are people out there that go, okay, I'll grab that because then I can pretend that I'm not wrong. I can hold that for the rest of my life and say, you don't understand. And this is, it's the last saving grace for a lot of these people. And I think that's what keeps happening, whatever that, even with COVID right now, with the narrative of the injection, is that they just go, well, but no, here's what Fauci said. Well, you know, here's all the peer-reviewed science. Don't you trust the science? It doesn't matter. Here's why you don't understand what that says. And they, like, I have a person in my family that's like that, who will, you know, everything he once said has now been shown, even in his conversation, to not be the reality, but he just has a rationale about why I still don't understand. And you know, but the second important point you made that I agree with, and I even fall to this, is that we shouldn't be focusing on that. And arguably maybe isn't an illusion. We should be focusing on the majority of people out there that may not be focused on by the false corporate media that are willing to ask questions. Maybe the real center. On the side note, the radical center is such an interesting statement. I don't even know how to make sense of that in my mind. How does that even work? Like, what happens when they get more radicalized? Which way do they go? Do they go up? Like, it's just I know it's just a term I'm making fun of.
What happens, Ryan, is that the extreme center, what they do, instead of going up or down, their head just goes directly.
Exactly.
And then as they get more and more extreme, they just sort of turn into a Fibonacci spiral. Yeah. It's of headassery. It's yeah.
So it just means that everyone's extreme everywhere now. Apparently, anybody involved in the paradigm system is extreme. That's how that works.
Well, they kind of are. They're
right.
You know, basically worshiping at the altar of a death cult every single day, whether they're giving their consent for it or not. And I can't think of an ideology more extreme than, you know, I mean, NATO's overall worldview, or the people who inhabit it. Certainly the people who make up the UN Secretary General position, and also, you know, NATO General, the very extreme ideologies, the entire government in Israel right now. Known to be one of the most extreme, yet supposedly representative of an overall, and you would assume, center of the population. So, I mean, you get to the point to where just through economic, foreign, and domestic policy, you have become this radical homunculus, and everyone else around you is you know, has to react to it or prepare for it or something like that. But you are not only are you the most radical faction, you're also the #1 terrorist organization on the planet. And we've seen this in multiple different avenues just in the last several months, what NATO's willing to do.
Right.
You know, certainly over the last year, what the U.S. with NATO's help is willing to do. These are all very extreme ideologies, very, very radical. I wholeheartedly agree with this concept of the extreme center.
And to tie that back to what we were just saying too, take Nord Stream, which I feel like was one of the points with what you're saying there, is that, you know, look at how much more evidence do like I'm not even just talking about Seymour Hersh's article, right? Because we can all point out it relies on an anonymous source, but with everything on the table, all they need to do is go, no, you don't understand. Here's the narrative. You know, even though that narrative is completely there's no evidence tied to it. It's just a government statement, but we have evidence or statements in the past, and yet people just go with it. You know, or rather, again, my point is, at least the perception is, the way the media is showing it, is that there's a body of people out there they claim is the majority that only agree with them, and we're still conspiracy theorists, you know. But it's an impossible feat. Like, even if it's 99.9% of people that are on our side, the media still stands up and goes, narrative, we all agree, you're wrong. And then a lot of people in that 99% don't see that. They still feel that they're that conspiracy. Like, where does the shift happen? Like, I don't see how, even with everybody on our side, as long as we still engage with this false dynamic of the media and how they seem to drive the bus and the topics. Like, I don't know. It's a question posed. How do we get past that? I feel like we're already there. I genuinely feel like we already have the majority of people in whether it's even 51% or more that see what we're talking about, you know? So what point do we see change, or is it even possible with where we are right now? You know?
Well, as I said before, I think we're in a territory where, you know, creating parallel structures, replacing is the only way this is going to go. I mean, so in answer to your point there, or to pick up on your point there, is that mainstream media is dead, can never come back from this, and it's going to probably be a slowish process, but it's got to go. There needs to be a complete replacement with what we see emerging now across the board, taking hold as the primary areas for debate and conversation within democracies, and the existing clique elite groups across the mainstream media are, you know, literally out. They should be out of a job. No one. I mean, I used to say to students, you know, listen to the BBC and to get that point of view. Now, there's no point. Just completely abandon the mainstream media.
That's interesting.
Don't watch them at all, and put all the support into alternative spaces, and then we win the battle that way, and then they shrivel and die, as it were.
That's so interesting. So is the argument that, so like right now going forward, we should just not even look at them anymore? Like, 'cause I think that might be where we go, right? Just, they don't count anymore.
Don't even take them. Don't give them any kind of payment, any kind of attention. One might want to study them for research purposes, but don't utilize them. Put the support into people who you trust and who are doing good work and so on. Right. And yeah, I complete abandonment. I certainly think that vast swathe of professional journalists, as they describe themselves in these organizations, should be absolutely ashamed of themselves for what they have been a part of, say, for example, during COVID in relation to the injections. And of course, some have started to come out and sort of say, you know, I knew things were wrong and so on. But, you know, it's not enough. And you know, I was at an event, at the UK event in Parliament, and there was somebody from the BBC there who was talking off the record and so on. And I understand the kind of the challenge it is for people they don't want to lose their job, and they've built their career, and et cetera, et cetera. But it does come a point at which, you know, you just have to stand up and say, right, enough is enough. I'm getting out, and so on. And there simply has not been enough of that in relation to what we've seen during COVID. I mean, I've heard enough times of, for example, mainstream journalists knowing that there were problems, for example, with the injection, you know, serious problems, and they're not saying anything. You know, at some point you just have to say enough is enough and step out, and so on. And I think that's the kind of thing that we need now. I think, you know, the mainstream journalists who want to carry on with some integrity should be just getting out and supporting independent or working independently or whatever. But we should never grant them any respect or time at all. it's a bit like when fact-checking organizations contact you and say, we have a list of questions about so an organization can think, oh, we should respond to this, and okay, let's deal with their fact, or just completely ignore them.
Mm-hmm.
Don't even respond, just treat them with the contempt that they deserve.
Yeah, no honest intentions there.
Sorry?
I just said, yeah, no honest intentions there. Like that's been made clear so many times throughout those fact checks.
So
well, let's go ahead, finish up your thought, Dr. Robinson. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's all. I just think kind of maybe going back to the conversation we we're having before, we had a point where a kind of a very ballsy stand up. We're not taking any more crap. We're going to start to do things our own way, set up our own parallel structures, schools, whatever, independent media, and just say we're not having any more nonsense from you, and we're not going to give you any more chances at this point in time. I learned that over Iraq kind of thing, that sort of, okay, don't trust them and so on, and it goes to governments as well. But now is the point at which we say no more, 5th, 6th, 7th chances. That's it. You've got to go. You've got to be replaced, and we've just got to work out how we do that in a constructive way and in a way that works.
Do you guys have a direction you want to go with this? Because I kind of want to ask a question to Dr. Robinson while he's here, because I think the argument or the discussion of terrain theory, germ theory is coming up again. The reason why I'm thinking about this is that there's a lot of talk out there about combining rallies and forces together. There were some people that were on the stage at the anti-war, the Rage Against the War Machine rally, that were on the same stage as the Defeat the Mandates rally. Now, I was talking with one of the guys who says, how do we bring these two together? But my thought process is, how do we bring together the terrain theory and the germ theory people, right? I mean, because if they're arguing about that one instant that, this wasn't an outbreak, this wasn't a lab leak, this wasn't a lab release, this is about taking advantage of the PCR test, getting a lot of false positives, then moving people into the shots eventually, to stop the whole spread of COVID, the thought of lockdown. Those groups that the virologists and the terrain theory people, they don't agree on that one thing, but they do agree that the PCR test was not adequate. They do agree that locking down the country was not right. They do agree that the vaccination was awful and you shouldn't take it from this point forward. And now a lot of them, from what I've known from talking to a lot of these doctors, they understand that this was about the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the Great Reset. How do we mend that bridge right there to get these two groups work together? That I think there's a lot of people in the mainstream are starting to pick these groups off and go, look at them. They're arguing with each other over this shit. We were right the whole time, and we needed to do. In fact, they took some polls out there, and there's a lot of people who thought we weren't firm enough in the United States with the lockdowns and the mandates.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
What are your thoughts there, Dr. Robinson? Because I know you're kind of swimming in those waters.
Well, just kind of brief, because I know we're coming up to the hour. I mean, I think it's very important for people to try and find areas where they agree on and make sure that, important, but not necessarily the biggest issues don't create divisions and get exploited. I mean, I think, there's always this danger in which people will, nefarious actors will seek to exploit cleavages in order to divide movements and cause argument and dissent within. You see this very clearly with the 9/11 movement over the years, with questionable people just creating havoc by sort of starting arguments over details of aspects of 9/11 and so on, when they actually agree on the bigger picture, etc., in relation to that. So I think it's important to to make sure that relatively, well, it's not insignificant, but that smaller issues don't divide, and also to be aware that actors will seek to exploit those divisions. And I think you're seeing this, aren't you, as you suggested with the lab leak issue. You can see how this is being played by some people. And of course, some people have said this is all being played in the direction of, especially with the Matt Hancock stuff coming out in the UK, this is being played in the direction of you can't trust these politicians. We need to get the World Health Organization, etc. So you can see how these people, actors, can exploit these arguments and so on. I mean, I've always, look, this is not really my area. I'm familiar with those debates, but I mean, it's always been the big issue with COVID-19 is the fact that wherever this thing came from, etc., it's the way in which it has been politicized and used and responded to. That's the big issue here. So it could have leaked out of a lab. It could have just it could have appeared at a much earlier point, etc. But the point is that this thing was clearly not dangerous in the way that it was presented as. I'm not saying that it wasn't necessarily harmful. But it was clearly exaggerated and exploited in order to do a lot of other political and economic things. And you've got to keep the eye on that ball rather than getting caught into what can become at times just very ferocious kind of arguments, infighting, which then get exploited. 9/11 Truth Movement is a good example of this. I mean, this is it's a movement, or a collection of scientists, public, and so on. But that's being caught by, is it Cass Sunstein, cognitive infiltration? Yeah, I mean, there's a term for this. You get people going into movements, they start creating arguments, or they invent, and then they start causing trouble, or they don't necessarily invent arguments, but they try and polarize opinion between groups, etc. It's cognitive infiltration. It's Cass Sunstein, 2007, wasn't it? I think that paper was written, and it's about messing up and preventing people, sort of staying focused on the big issue. That COVID response was wrong. The injections, etc., are obviously deeply problematic, and we need to have a thoroughgoing sort of reckoning of the forces which were behind that, as well as the various incompetent politicians caught up in the stream of the whole thing. But people like Matt Hancock are they're the minnows in all of this, right? Does that answer your question?
Morgan. Thank you, Robinson. Dr.
Well,
Robinson. Yeah, as
if
best
I can
you
add
can.
something to that. One. I'd like to add something to that too, just on that general point. And it's a good conversation to have right now. Like any division, like how do we bring people together to see the real problem? I mean, that's what I see the two-party paradigm being. It is a division tactic to stop us from seeing that we're all being manipulated by the entity that we're talking about. But in the context of the terrain germ theory conversation, I mean, the way it was framed, my mindset would be, at least from the circles that I'm in, I'm sure there are people out there in the germ theory world that are just as rabid and absolutist as the people on the terrain side. I mean, I almost can guarantee that. But the point is, in this conversation, I see a lot of people that are like, look, I just have questions about the overlap, the terrain theory. Like there's even parts that I've had conversations about that I personally don't think add up. These are just my opinions. And the moment that these conversations are had, or like questions are posed, certain people, and you can make the same argument in reverse, will go out of their way to make it about, you're now shilling for the government, that you're dishonest, that you don't have. And I'm just like, whoa, I'm just trying to ask questions. Can't we just have, like, what if I just look at all the evidence you put forward and I just come to a different conclusion? That has to be possible, right? So my point is that I agree with you completely, Piers. I think there's an issue right now where there are people in a valid conversation that we should be having that are making it impossible to actually have that conversation, to debate, probably because there's more valid points there than we realize, and this is where I've ended up, where I tend to think, and they don't like this answer, that there's more of a mesh between them. There's misunderstandings on all sides of this. But again, I'm not the expert. I'm just trying to base it off things that I understand, but we should bring these things together. And I argue that would happen, especially people that are in my field. I'm more than happy to stand next to people that have different opinions, as long as we both go, we're looking for the truth, but they don't like that. And the people that I'm talking about, I've got Derek Bros right now is going through this like relentless attack on Twitter of people that are saying just because he asks this question that he doesn't understand that he's actually hiding the truth because of some ulterior motive, and it's like, I know that's not true. And they should ask those questions. And that's the larger point. Should we ask these questions 100%, whether it's about 9/11, no planes, which is kind of the point of that main division point, or whether we're talking terrain germ, we should absolutely ask these questions, but people need to be okay with somebody being like, I disagree, or I'm just still trying to figure it out for myself, you know?
Yeah, this is something we've lost. I mean, you mentioned the post-truth world, and we've talked about disinformation and the loss of rational debate. This is the one of the things which I notice, and you seem to notice as well, time and time again, in whatever group or conversations one's having, is that this inability that some people have to just, engage in just civilized, rational discussion with other people, and to allow people to sort of and to discuss their opinions. The kind of sort of the ideal vision you'd have of a university academic seminar with students and so on, that you allow people to express their opinions without starting to question motives, etc. And actually also critically to allow everyone to be heard, and not to keep on trying to gatekeep and so on. There's so much gatekeeping going on. I saw it throughout my time within academic institutions and so on. It obviously happens in the mainstream media, but all of these things have an incredibly negative impact on our ability to have rational, civilized discussions about issues. And we kind of need to have some kind of restatement of the need for that. What does it mean to engage in sort of dialogical, two-way communication with somebody, where you sort of take on board, consider, evaluate, etc. We need to relearn, I think, those basic principles of rational discourse and so on, because they certainly have been, I think, sort of pushed out the way. But me being sort of, I think there are a lot of people, and taking my cue from Cass Sunstein, there are a lot of people who are also there causing trouble, and they know that they're causing trouble, and so on. And obviously, I don't go into any details of anything that I've been involved in the last 5-6 years, but I have come across times where you think, okay, my trust rating on that person has to go down, because I think they're causing so much trouble and so on. So I think we've learned a lot about propaganda, haven't we, and about how governments construct, and we also have learned, or we need to learn, that cognitive infiltration, the fact that you have people who are there to cause trouble. But again, I think, maybe picking up on your point, we shouldn't be going around being paranoid about that. Most of the time, you just got people who are just caught in positions and not being tolerant enough, etc.
Yeah.
But it's not always the case. There are some people messing with the debate and so on at times.
I think that's an absolute. I think we agree on that. But I agree with your first point there, is that I think that's actually probably more of the problem. There's a lot of people that just, with good intentions, get wrapped into it. Because we know how this can be done with the documentary. You present points that seem completely flawless, and they go, "Wow, okay, I'm taken by that," and they just don't look back. And it doesn't mean you ignore that, but just realize not everybody out there, even those saying the things we're talking about, are in this for some kind of they're not some CIA agent, right? That's possible, and we should ask those questions, but there's too much assumption happening today, and I think that's wildly being leaned into, inflamed. Like, I always make the overlap. I do think that the new Twitter scenario is really is promoting the willingness to assume based on face value information, like Twitter screenshots and so on, which are important. I've never said they're not important, but the way everyone engages right now is increasingly getting more assumptive and more, that we already have a narrative, therefore anything that aligns with it is the truth. And anybody says otherwise needs to prove it. It's like, whoa, that's completely backward. It's like, it should be the other way around. It's getting problematic. But again, I'm more hopeful than anything. We're just highlighting the, I think, fringe problem as opposed to the all-encompassing issue,
Yeah, and it will quickly. It amazes me how people have gone after the question everything guy for asking a question or two. They're like, "Oh, it's great, Ryan. Question everything. Okay, no, except for that. Except for that. If you question that, then we have problems." And why wouldn't you expect it, Piers? It is so fantastic to see you again, to have a conversation with you. Truly appreciate you giving us some of your time, and do come back. It's been far too long. We should do this a little bit more regularly. Please let people know specifically where they can be most helpful towards all of your different projects and all the stuff you have going on. And thank you again.
Take a look at Propaganda in Focus, because that's we're really sort of launched that. That's going very well. We've got about 40 odd writers, and then I don't know how many. We've published a lot of articles since May, so you know, and it's linked to the Organisation of Propaganda Studies, in the sense that Dan Brody and Ben Lindsley, my co-editors, but it's there to try to sort of bring sort of kind of a hybrid of academic or expert, but also sort of more engaging material, etc., to a wider public. So that's Propaganda in Focus. Propagandainfocus.com, and it's free. You don't have to pay to read the material. I'm doing work with Pandata, which is a great organization. Look at my Twitter handle and you'll see all the things I'm involved in. Still involved in the OPCW Syria issue, and on that, working with Hans von Sponeck, Jose Vistani, who's the first Director General of the OPCW, and Professor Richard Folk on the issues raised by the whistleblowers from the OPCW in relation to chemical weapons attacks in Syria. So that's a very important area of my work at the moment, and continues to be. So people can check out that.
Thank you for that
spread
work.
the word.
That's very important work. Syria is just, it's floated off the map, and we're right back to where we started from. The white helmets are back in there. You know, most members of Congress, only 2 said no, Thomas Massey and Marjorie Taylor Greene, to not funding the white helmets. I mean, they want to fund the white helmets. They still want to remove Assad. It's in their policy. So thank you for doing that work, because it's true. It's a shame for what's going on in Syria right now. Totally a shame.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you, Piers. Huge respect, brother. Keep it up.
Yeah, good to see you all. And
Dr. Robinson.
Okay. Have a good day.
You too.